What distinguishes some, even amongst other industry titans? With such a saturated populace, the music industry has taught us that long term success is not just about charting. Rather, it's about having a clear, cohesive, artistic vision. In one of her several Vanity Fair interviews, Billie Eilish talks about her writing process for her single, What Was I Made For? A song she wrote for the soundtrack of Greta Gerwig's Barbie. It's a piece about a shattered identity, quiet frustration, and about not feeling enough. So, through her artistic and personal experience, she understood that it would require a very personal, vulnerable sound.
Could have literally done like a I used to float and now but that's not what the song wanted, you know, and I could have gone I used to float. There's so many ways I could have sung it, but none of it worked the way that this kind of heartbroken, almost like you were just crying and now you're singing delivery was, and it was the hardest choice of all of the choices I could have made.
She's not the kind of artist that just accepts whatever idea pops into her head. She really takes the time to deconstruct, analyze, and find the most ideal version of each one of them. In my opinion, this is something that she's really good at. She really goes down deep to the emotional core of everything she and Phineas write about. And you can see it not only in her writing, but also her performance. But if you and I really try to get anything out of this, we have to define what this emotional core is. How do we learn from it objectively? I like the way literary theorist Peli Greitzer looks at it. He calls this emotional core the point of aesthetic unity. He essentially explains it like this. He asks us to imagine a machine learning model that aims to learn how to recreate things. Let's call this model Christopher. If we try to teach Christopher how to recreate human faces, we would feed it tons of images of people's faces. Now, in an attempt to understand what it's seeing, Christopher would make observations and compile what Greitzer calls a shortlist. It's a general list of values that can be observed throughout the dataset. Now, he will use this shortlist to find what general elements create the concept of human face. So our shortlist could be facial feature measurements, for example, since they are the thing present in most all face samples. Now, while Christopher is trying his best to understand what a human face is, since he's only taking into consideration features that are present in the vast majority of the dataset, like eyes and ears and a mouth, he's inevitably going to miss a lot of details. These omitted details are what Greitzer calls the excess material reality. Excess might sound like they're unnecessary or a waste, but all he's trying to say here is that these details do not fit into the essence or the conceptual form of the thing. And more importantly, he suggests that everything left, after you strip away the excess material reality, is the thing's point of aesthetic unity. And this is very important because this point of aesthetic unity is the point of origin from which an artist should make all their creative decisions regarding a project. It's the soul of the project. Because in music, or any art really, aesthetic unity services the feeling or sensation the artist is trying to evoke. And in modern semantics, we call this emotional side of aesthetic unity vibe. I want to make it very clear that I believe that nuance and detail in art is very important, but oftentimes I see beginner composers, for instance, get carried away trying to show off their counterpoint skills or their harmony skills, and they miss that emotional mark. And if you don't aim to hit this emotional mark, your artwork is really going to struggle to connect personally with other people. And again, I'm in no way against the fostering of technical skills, because in mastering a craft, one acquires a very expansive toolkit to express more detailed, more nuanced emotions or sensations. Kind of like if you were a painter, having a wider color palette allows you to render more detailed images. That's what technical craft is to me. But remember, nuance only matters if it's tied together with aesthetic unity. Sometimes this aesthetic unity is not concrete, and that's okay. Just make sure that every variable that you add to your artwork is going through some sort of filter that you're really scrutinizing so that it fits into your sound world or into your visual world. For instance, in the music world, it's actually very well known that Billie and Phineas are extremely meticulous when crafting Billie's vocal line.
Usually what I do is a bunch of takes, make sure that each one, there's something usable for every single part. So do you see all of those lines? Those are all
separate
cuts.
audio files that have been put into one take. We got up to like 87 takes.
They always make sure that everything always links back to the vibe of the song. A good example of how sounding or appearing effortless is everything but effortless.
5, 6, 5, 6, 7, 8.
There's an artist relatively new to the spotlight that takes a very different but very unique approach to this aesthetic unity concept. While we were discussing how Billie and Phineas are very meticulous about creating very cohesive musical narratives, Chappell Roan is all about brand. She presents this joyful, free-spirited image that is so captivating on many different fronts. She has a lot of interesting visual motifs. Like for instance, we all know she's an active member of the LGBT community, and what this means is bold makeup, bright colors, fluffy hair. That on its own is extremely head-turning, right? But she doesn't stop there. She seamlessly connects these visual motifs to those of 1980s fashion, with her fluffy hair and bright glittery leotards and then big, bold shoulder pads. At least those are what are present on her most iconic looks. Now, obviously, as a musician, I'm much more interested in how those things manifest into her music, because they do. From the youthful angst in her arrangements to her deviation from cursive singing that is very popular today, she has this sort of striking, strong voice, very reminiscent to that of Pat Benatar and other artists of the 1980s. Not to mention the plethora of synthesizers that are very reminiscent of that style. Now, if you're knowledgeable of the music making process in general, you might have noticed that the branding makes its way into the mixing of the songs themselves. Like for instance, in her single Hot to Go, I really like the treatment that mix engineer Mitch McCarthy did to the vocals. He ran them through a bandpass filter, giving them a vintage, almost telephony quality, on top of which he added a very tight delay known as a slapback delay. It's a technique used prominently throughout the 80s, and you might know it from records like Bad by Michael Jackson, or I Was Made for Loving You by Kiss, or Little Red Corvette by Prince, or Rebel Yell by Billy Idol, or Back in Black by AC/DC, just to name a few. And it's true that we've seen a resurgence of this like mixing color in Sabrina Carpenter's Please Please Please, or way earlier in The Weeknd's Blinding Lights. But what I feel is so compelling about Chappell Roan's brand use of this sort of like mixing effect, coloristic choices, is how integrated they feel into her brand world. Because if you zoom out, you realize that none of her visual or musical decisions are coincidental. They make up a very well-balanced design that stems from understanding her personal uniqueness, on top of which her team created an aesthetic plan. And in some ways, this is kind of what branding is in general. It's just that in her case, it comes across as incredibly authentic. And my personal takeaway from this is that aesthetic plans really work best when they're backed up by authenticity. Because if you do really good introspective work and you truly understand how you feel or how you view the world, you're way more likely to paint it accurately. And that might make people sort of empathize with it. They might even identify with your work. My mission with this channel is not only to dissect how art and artists work, although that's a pretty big part of what I like to study. The value that I'd like to bring to you is to help you connect yourself with your art, because it's overlooked how difficult this is to achieve. I'd really like to foster a more introspective society, and what better way to do it than by helping someone make their art more personal? And not to be melodramatic, but it's never been more important to create art that is profoundly human. AI has wedged itself into all sorts of industries, and unfortunately, art was no exception. But to be more on the optimistic side, now that social media is full to the brim with AI content, I noticed that it's actually quite easy to sniff out. I believe this might be because as humans, we're thirsty for experiences that we can relate to. And more, that differentiating factor that makes or breaks an artistic career is how embedded the artist's work is with meaning. We can no longer distinguish ourselves with technical skill alone. If AI can do what you do now, it will at some point. And that's why I am so adamant about finding that irreplicable human angle.